My shoulders ached from carrying my luggage through 3 airports. The caffeine from my last coffee had worn off hours ago, and all I wanted was to collapse into my own bed. I had been gone for 5 days on a business trip that could make or break my career, a chance at a promotion that would finally give me some financial breathing room. I trudged up my walkway, the familiar sight of my front door bringing a sense of relief. Home at last. I slid my key into the lock and turned. Nothing happened. I tried again, jiggling the key, thinking perhaps it was just stuck. Still nothing. I pulled the key out and examined it, confirming it was indeed the right one. I checked the house number. Yes, this was definitely my home. I tried once more, applying more pressure, but the key refused to turn. Confusion gave way to suspicion, then to dawning horror as I noticed a small piece of paper taped to the door. I tore it off and read it under the fading evening light. Notice of violation, unauthorized decorative elements on front facade. Action taken, security measure implementation. Contact HOA office during business hours. Signed, Richard Thornton, HOA President. My confusion transformed into white-hot anger. They had changed my locks, without warning, without permission, because of flower pots, the same terracotta planters that had brightened my entrance for years. I pulled out my phone and dialed the HOA office. No answer. Closed for the day. I called Richard Thornton directly, straight to voicemail. I left a message that started professionally but ended with my voice trembling with rage. The rain began to fall as I sat on my porch, locked out of my own home. I called 5 locksmiths before finding one available for emergency service. That will be $300 for after-hours service, he informed me. My stomach dropped. That was exactly what I had budgeted for groceries until my next paycheck. I had no choice but to agree. For 2 hours I waited, sheltering under my small porch overhang as the rain pounded down. The locksmith finally arrived, looking as tired as I felt. He worked quickly, drilling out the new lock and installing a replacement. I handed over my credit card, trying not to wince as he processed the payment. That was breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the next 2 weeks gone in an instant. Once inside, I dropped my bags in the hallway and slumped against the wall, breathing in the familiar scent of my home. On my entry table sat another envelope, slipped through the mail slot before the locks were changed. I tore it open to find a formal HOA violation notice with photos of my flower pots circled in angry red marker. Non-conforming color scheme was written across the top. The fine, $150, due within 7 days. I sank to the floor, calculating the damage. $450 I could not afford, charged without warning, without a chance to address the so-called violation. My refrigerator held perhaps 3 days' worth of food. My bank account held even less. The promotion I was chasing would not materialize for at least 2 more pay cycles, if at all. That night I did not sleep. I stared at my ceiling, alternating between anxiety about how I would eat for the next 2 weeks and simmering rage at the casual cruelty of what had been done to me. It was not just about the money, though that was devastating enough. It was the violation, the idea that someone could lock me out of my own home over flower pots. As dawn broke, I made myself a promise. This would not stand. I had always been the quiet resident who paid dues on time and kept to myself. But something had shifted inside me. The door they had locked me out of would become the first in a series of doors I would push open, doors that hid their secrets, their abuses of power, their corruption. They had no idea who they had just awakened. Our neighborhood had not always been this way. When I purchased my home 5 years ago, Oak Ridge Estates was a friendly community with reasonable rules designed to maintain property values and shared spaces. The monthly HOA fee was modest, the amenities well maintained, and the board members were regular folks who rotated responsibility every couple of years. Everything changed 3 years ago when Richard Thornton moved in and quickly maneuvered his way onto the board. Within 6 months, he had become president through a special election held during summer when many residents were on vacation. From that moment, our community began its transformation. Richard was in his 60s, retired from some corporate job that he never failed to mention at every meeting. He wore crisp polo shirts tucked into perfectly pressed khakis, and his silver hair was always immaculately styled. But his most memorable feature was his smile, a tight, practiced expression that never reached his cold blue eyes. I spent the morning after my lockout researching our HOA's history through old newsletters and meeting minutes. The pattern was clear. Under Richard's leadership, violations had increased by 340%. The average fine amount had doubled. Special assessments had become routine rather than emergency measures. And the board meetings, once casual community gatherings, had become formal affairs with strict speaking time limits and aggressive enforcement of arcane parliamentary procedures. My neighbor Alina, a widow in her 70s, had been fined for planting vegetables instead of flowers in her garden beds. The Jensen family had received multiple violations for their son's basketball hoop, despite it being properly installed and only visible from their driveway. And most disturbingly, the Watkins family had been forced to sell their home after accumulating fines they could not pay when Mr. Watkins lost his job. I spent the day making discreet inquiries around the neighborhood. Through careful conversations, I learned that Richard had personal connections to several vendors who serviced our community. The landscaping company was owned by his brother-in-law. The pool maintenance contract had been awarded to his former colleague's business, and the security company that handled enforcement matters, like changing locks, belonged to his son. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening. I arrived early, notebook in hand, determined to get answers. The community room at our clubhouse was arranged with military precision, rows of chairs facing a raised table where the board members sat like judges. Richard sat center, flanked by his loyal followers. Margaret, a retired school administrator who handled violations. Tom, a local business owner who managed finances. And Diane, who took meticulous minutes but rarely spoke. I signed up for the 3-minute comment period allowed for residents. When my turn came, I approached the microphone set up in the center of the room. My name is Alex Morgan. Yesterday, I returned home to find my locks changed without notice because of flower pots that have been on my porch for 5 years. I was forced to pay $300 for emergency locksmith services. I would like to understand the legal basis for entering my property and changing my locks without proper notice. Richard leaned forward, that empty smile firmly in place. Ms. Morgan, all homeowners signed covenants agreeing to abide by HOA regulations. Section 17, Paragraph 4 authorizes the board to take necessary security measures in cases of persistent violations. I had no prior notifications about any violations, I countered, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Richard shuffled some papers. Our records indicate 3 notices were sent. Perhaps you should check your mail more carefully. Next resident, please. That is not true, I said, refusing to step away from the microphone. I have never received any. The sharp bang of Richard's gavel cut me off. Your time is up, Ms. Morgan. This matter can be addressed by submitting a formal appeal with the appropriate $200 filing fee. I looked around the room. 20 or so neighbors sat with eyes downcast, no one willing to make eye contact. The message was clear: they had all been here before. They had all been silenced. One more thing, Richard added as I turned to leave. The board has noticed several other potential violations at your property that will require inspection. Expect our compliance team this week." The threat was unmistakable. I returned to my seat, hands trembling with rage beneath my notebook. As the meeting continued, I observed the dynamics more closely. Every proposal Richard made passed unanimously. Every resident concern was dismissed or referred to a committee. This was not governance. This was a dictatorship dressed up in suburban pleasantries. Walking home under the streetlights, I realized that my fight had just expanded. This was not about flower pots or even about my locks. This was about an entire community living under the thumb of a petty tyrant. Someone needed to stand up to Richard Thornton, and it seemed that someone would have to be me. The threat of additional inspections lit a fire under me. I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. The next morning, I called in sick to work and transformed my kitchen table into a research center. My laptop, notebooks, and cups of coffee became my weapons in what I was beginning to see as a battle for justice. First, I needed to understand the law. I downloaded our state's Property Owners Association Act and began highlighting key sections. What I found stunned me. There were numerous protections for homeowners that our HOA routinely ignored. The law required proper notice before any enforcement action. It mandated a hearing process before fines could be imposed. And most importantly, it explicitly prohibited entering a private residence or changing locks, except in genuine emergencies involving imminent danger or structural damage. What Richard had done to me was not just unfair, it was illegal. I created a spreadsheet to document every interaction I had with the HOA. Dates, times, people involved, actions taken, money spent. This would become my evidence trail. I took photos of my flower pots, collecting proof that they matched several others in the neighborhood that had not received violations. Next, I needed allies. I started with Alina, the widow who had been fined for her vegetable garden. She invited me in for tea, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. "I have been scared to talk about it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper even in her own home. "After my citation, they kept finding new violations. My fence needs painting. My mailbox is the wrong shade of black. My holiday decorations stayed up one day too long. I live on a fixed income. I cannot afford these fines, but I am too old to move." Alina showed me her violation notices, 17 in the past year. The pattern of harassment was obvious and heartbreaking. Before I left, I asked if she would be willing to share her documentation if it came to legal action. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded. Over the next week, I spoke with 15 neighbors. 13 had similar stories. The Patels had been cited for cooking odors from traditional Indian meals. The Garcias had received violations for having family gatherings that created excessive vehicles in the visitor parking area. Robert Chen had been fined because his trash can was visible from the street on trash day. I created a secure online document where willing neighbors could anonymously log their experiences. Slowly, the entries began to appear. 20 violations, then 50, then over 100. The pattern was undeniable. Certain homeowners were targeted repeatedly while others, particularly those friendly with Richard, never received citations. My cousin Megan, a paralegal at a real estate law firm, provided critical guidance. "Document everything," she advised during our video call. "Take photos with timestamps. Record conversations if your state allows one-party consent. Request all HOA financial records. They are legally required to provide them." Following her advice, I submitted a formal request for the HOA's financial records for the past 3 years. The response came 5 days later. An email from Diane stating that my request would take up to 30 business days to process and would incur a document preparation fee of $250. Another illegal action. State law mandated access within 10 business days and limited fees to reasonable copying costs. While waiting for those records, I dug into public information. The county recorder's office provided a gold mine of data. I discovered that the security company that changed my locks, Thornton Security Solutions, was indeed registered to Richard's son, Michael Thornton. The landscaping company, Prime Properties Maintenance, listed Richard's home address as its business address. Most disturbing was what I found about foreclosures in our community. 7 homes had been foreclosed upon in the past 2 years due to unpaid HOA dues and fines. All 7 had been purchased at auction by a company called RT Investments, Richard Thornton's initials. My evidence wall grew daily, red string connecting documents, photos, and names. Coffee cups piled up as I worked late into the night. My regular job suffered, but I could not stop. This had become more than a personal vendetta. It was a mission to expose corruption that was destroying lives. One night, as I added another string to my wall connecting Richard to the locksmith company that had charged me $300, I realized I had transformed. The tired, defeated person who had slumped against their door in the rain was gone. In their place stood someone with purpose, with evidence, with righteous anger. Richard Thornton had created his worst nightmare, an opponent with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Despite everything I had discovered, I decided to attempt resolving the situation reasonably. Perhaps the board did not fully understand what Richard was doing. Perhaps they would recognize the legal liability they faced and correct course. I still hoped to avoid a lengthy, expensive legal battle that none of us homeowners could truly afford. I spent an entire weekend drafting a formal letter. The tone was professional but firm. I outlined the specific violations of state law regarding my lock change. I included photographs of identical flower pots on other properties that had received no violations, demonstrating selective enforcement. I cited the specific sections of state law that protected homeowners from arbitrary enforcement. I requested reimbursement for the locksmith fee and withdrawal of the violation notice. I printed 3 copies, one for certified mail to the HOA official address, one hand-delivered to Diane as board secretary, and one sent directly to Richard's home. I wanted no claim that they had not received proper notice. For 5 days there was silence. On the 6th day, a white HOA envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a single-paragraph response on official letterhead. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Board has reviewed your correspondence dated May 7th and finds no merit in your claims. All actions taken were in accordance with community guidelines. Your appeal is denied. Please remit payment for all outstanding violations within 7 days to avoid additional enforcement actions. Signed, Richard Thornton, President. That same afternoon, I noticed a man in a Thornton Security Solutions polo shirt taking photographs of my home. He methodically documented every inch of my property, paying particular attention to my recently replanted flower pots, which now contained HOA-approved flowers in HOA-approved colors. 2 days later, another violation notice appeared on my door. Improper window treatment, visible interior items. The photos showed my bookshelf, visible through my living room window. The fine, $200. The next week brought 2 more violations: unauthorized doormat design and non-conforming house numbers, improper font. Another $300 in fines, bringing my total to $650, almost an entire mortgage payment. My neighbors noticed. Alina called to tell me that while walking her dog, she had observed the security company specifically visiting my home 3 separate times in 1 week. The Garcias mentioned seeing Richard himself driving slowly past my house, taking notes. This was not random enforcement. This was targeted harassment. The final straw came when I returned home from grocery shopping to find another man measuring my driveway with a tape measure. When I asked what he was doing, he presented a badge identifying him as an HOA compliance officer. Just confirming the width of your driveway, ma'am. We have reports it may be 3 inches wider than permitted in the guidelines. That evening, I received an email from Tom, the HOA treasurer, with the subject line, "Courtesy Notice of Lien Consideration." The message stated that due to my accumulated unpaid fines, the board was preparing to place a lien on my property. I stood in my kitchen, hands gripping the counter until my knuckles turned white. I had tried reason. I had tried diplomacy. I had extended an olive branch, and in return, they had tried to burn down my tree. Through my window, I could see several neighbors walking their dogs, pushing strollers, living their lives, all of them under the shadow of fear created by Richard and his cronies. All of them one arbitrary violation away from financial hardship. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the contact Megan had provided. Jennifer Hamilton, attorney at law, HOA disputes. My thumb hovered over the call button for just a moment before I pressed it. The olive branch had failed. It was time for a different approach. Jennifer Hamilton's office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown. The waiting room featured comfortable chairs and framed newspaper articles about HOA cases she had won. When the receptionist led me to her office, I was surprised by Jennifer herself, a woman in her 50s with bright red reading glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor. I had brought my evidence organized in a binder, violation notices, financial records, photographs, neighbor testimonials, and a timeline of events. Jennifer listened without interruption as I explained everything, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she removed her glasses and looked directly at me. "They changed your locks because of flower pots." I nodded. "Without prior written notice or a court order." I nodded again. Jennifer leaned back in her chair. "That is not just HOA overreach. That is breaking and entering. That is illegal trespass. And if they have done this to you, they have likely done it to others." She flipped through my binder, pausing on the connections I had made between Richard and the vendors. "This goes beyond typical HOA abuse of power. This appears to be systematic self-dealing and potentially embezzlement." For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of hope. Someone with authority believed me. Someone with knowledge confirmed what I had suspected. We developed a 3-pronged strategy. First, a cease and desist letter regarding the harassment and illegal entry. Second, a formal complaint to the state agency overseeing property owners' associations. Third, preparation for a potential lawsuit if the first 2 approaches did not resolve the situation. Jennifer's legal assistant prepared the cease and desist letter that afternoon. It outlined the specific laws broken, demanded withdrawal of all fines, reimbursement for the locksmith, and an end to targeted enforcement. The letter concluded with a clear statement. Failure to comply within 10 business days will result in legal action including but not limited to claims for illegal trespass, harassment, selective enforcement, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of state statutes governing homeowners associations. The letter was delivered the next morning by courier, requiring signature confirmation. By that evening, emergency notices appeared throughout the neighborhood announcing a special HOA board meeting. I attended that meeting, sitting quietly in the back row. Richard appeared visibly agitated, his normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled. He called the meeting to order and immediately proposed a special legal defense fund assessment of $500 per household due to potential litigation expenses. My heart sank. He was planning to use my neighbors' money to fight against their own interests. Before the vote, I raised my hand. Mr. Thornton, would this assessment be used to defend against claims related to illegal entry into homes, unauthorized changing of locks, or self-dealing with vendors owned by board members' families? The room fell silent. Richard's face flushed red. That is defamatory and incorrect information. I have documentation proving otherwise, I replied calmly. Documentation that has now been submitted to state authorities. The meeting devolved into chaos. Several homeowners began asking questions about the vendor relationships. Others wanted to know about the lock changing policy. Richard abruptly adjourned the meeting without a vote on the assessment. The next day, I received notice that a lien had been placed on my property for unpaid assessments and fines totaling $1,450. They had added new fines overnight, including one for disruptive behavior at HOA meetings. Jennifer filed for an emergency injunction against the lien. The court scheduled a hearing for the following week, but in the meantime, my credit score took a hit. My pending mortgage refinance application was flagged for review. The financial damage was real and immediate. I continued documenting everything. When Thornton Security Solutions trucks appeared in our neighborhood 3 times that week, I photographed them. When Richard was observed entering homes with the security company, I recorded dates and addresses. The day before our court hearing, a thick envelope arrived at my door by courier. Inside was a settlement offer. The HOA would remove the lien and waive all fines if I would sign a confidentiality agreement and withdraw all complaints. The letter emphasized that this was a one-time good faith offer that would expire in 24 hours. I called Jennifer immediately. "They are scared," she said. "This confirms we have something real. But this settlement protects them, not you or your neighbors. It would prevent you from sharing evidence with authorities or other homeowners." That night I could not sleep. The settlement would solve my immediate problems. My credit would be restored. The financial burden would be lifted. I could go back to my quiet life. But Richard would continue his reign of terror over my neighbors. The corruption would continue unchecked. By morning, my decision was made. I faxed a single-sentence response to the HOA attorney. "The offer is declined." Then I put on my best outfit and headed to court, ready for the first public battle in what I now understood would be a war for the soul of our community. The injunction hearing was surprisingly brief. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience, reviewed our documentation and immediately ordered the lien removed pending full review of the case. She also issued a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from imposing new fines or entering my property without court permission. While this victory protected me personally, it did nothing to address the systemic corruption infecting our community. For that, we needed more evidence that likely existed only in the HOA's financial records. 3 days after the hearing, I received an anonymous text message from an unknown number. "Parking garage, level B2, northwest corner, tomorrow, 9 p.m. Jennifer advised against meeting an unknown person in a deserted parking garage. Instead, we agreed I would arrive early, stay in my car with the doors locked, and watch from a distance. If anything seemed suspicious, I would leave immediately. The parking garage was eerily quiet that evening. I positioned my car with a clear view of the meeting spot and waited. At precisely 9 p.m., a figure appeared, a middle-aged woman I recognized as Carol, the HOA's part-time bookkeeper who worked under Tom's supervision. I approached cautiously, staying in well-lit areas. Carol looked nervously over her shoulder before speaking. "I cannot be seen talking to you. I could lose my job, but what they are doing is wrong." She handed me a USB drive. Financial records for the past 5 years, account transfers, board meeting recordings they claim do not exist, emails about targeting specific homeowners. I have made copies for myself as protection. Before I could thank her, Carol hurried away, the click of her heels echoing through the concrete structure. That night, Jennifer and I reviewed the files. What we found was staggering. Over 5 years, nearly $500,000 had been diverted from our HOA reserves through inflated vendor contracts. Richard had been taking kickbacks from each vendor, 20% of contract values paid as consulting fees, to a shell company registered in his wife's maiden name. More disturbing were the emails outlining their strategy for forcing out undesirable homeowners through targeted enforcement. Richard had created a priority list of homes he wanted to acquire through foreclosure, with notes about property values and potential resale profits. The recordings revealed board discussions explicitly acknowledging the illegality of their actions, with Richard assuring members they were protected because no one has the resources to fight us in court. Jennifer immediately contacted the district attorney's office with our evidence. Within days, investigators were reviewing the financial records. The local news caught wind of the story, and suddenly our quiet neighborhood was featured on the evening broadcast. The headline was damning: HOA president accused of corruption, self-dealing, and homeowner harassment. The coverage spread quickly. More neighbors came forward with their stories. The Watkins family, who had lost their home to foreclosure, shared how Richard had personally purchased their house at auction for 60% of market value through his investment company. As public pressure mounted, Richard attempted damage control. The HOA attorney arrived at my door with a new settlement offer: triple my locksmith costs, removal of all fines, and complete withdrawal of any claims against me. The amount was substantial, and the non-disclosure agreement even more restrictive than before. "This is a generous offer from the board," the attorney said, his expression neutral but his tone urgent. "They are prepared to make this right for you personally." I glanced at the settlement figure, enough to cover my financial hardship and then some. It was tempting after weeks of stress and uncertainty. But the final paragraph caught my attention. I would be prohibited from assisting in any investigation or sharing information with other homeowners. "They are not offering justice," I said, handing back the document. "They are trying to buy my silence." That evening, homeowners gathered in Alina's backyard, the first time many had spoken openly about their experiences with the HOA. The Garcias brought homemade empanadas. Robert Chen set up extra chairs. The Patels supplied chai for everyone. As neighbors shared their stories, connections formed. The sense of isolation Richard had carefully cultivated began to dissolve. By the end of the night, we had formed the Oak Ridge Homeowners Alliance, a group committed to transparency and fair governance. Our first action was a petition calling for a special election to recall the entire board. Richard's response was swift and desperate. A mass email went out to all homeowners claiming I was a disgruntled rule breaker, leading a dangerous campaign of lies that would destroy property values and community standards. But his power was already crumbling. The district attorney had opened a formal investigation. 3 board members privately approached Jennifer about immunity deals in exchange for testimony. And most significantly, our community had found its voice. The door that had once locked me out had indeed opened something unexpected, not just for me, but for every homeowner who had suffered in silence. Justice was no longer a distant hope, but an approaching reality. The courthouse steps were crowded with my neighbors on the morning of the hearing. Eleanor stood at my side, her hand gripping my arm for both support and solidarity. The Garcias, the Patels, the Chens, and dozens of other families formed a protective circle around us as we navigated past news cameras and reporters. Inside, the courtroom fell silent as the judge entered. Richard sat at the defense table, flanked by expensive attorneys. He had lost weight in the months since the investigation began, his previously immaculate appearance now haggard. He avoided looking in my direction. The evidence presentation took hours. Financial records displayed on large screens showed hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from our HOA accounts to vendors, and then partially back to Richard's shell companies. Emails revealed explicit discussions about targeting specific homeowners for enforcement to drive them out. Audio recordings played Richard's own voice instructing security personnel to change locks without proper notice as a pressure tactic. Most damning was the testimony from Tom, the former treasurer, who had accepted a plea deal. Richard said it was a perfect system, Tom testified. The homeowners had no power individually. He said by the time anyone figured it out, he would own half the neighborhood through foreclosures and flips. When the judge finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such calculated abuse of power and position. This court finds in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts. The judgment was comprehensive. Richard and the board were removed immediately. They were ordered to repay all illegal fees and fines collected over 5 years, with interest. A court-appointed administrator would oversee HOA operations until new elections could be held. For Richard personally, the consequences continued mounting. The district attorney announced criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. His real estate license was suspended pending investigation. The state agency overseeing HOAs began proceedings to bar him from ever serving on a community board again. As we left the courthouse, a reporter thrust a microphone toward me. "How does it feel to take down a corrupt HOA president?" I considered the question carefully. This was never about taking someone down. It was about lifting our community up, about restoring fairness and decency to a place we all call home. 2 weeks later, we held elections in the community clubhouse. The turnout was unprecedented. Over 90% of homeowners participated. The new board included Eleanor, Robert Chen, Maria Garcia, and myself. We immediately passed new bylaws requiring financial transparency, proper notice procedures, and limitations on fines and enforcement actions. Our first official act was to commission a forensic audit of all HOA accounts. The second was to terminate contracts with all vendors connected to former board members. The third was to establish an appeals process that gave homeowners genuine recourse against unfair enforcement. In the months that followed, our community transformed. The fear that had kept neighbors isolated dissipated. Garden clubs formed. Children played together in front yards. Block parties became regular events rather than rare occurrences. 1 year after the lockout that had started everything, We gathered in the community park for a neighborhood celebration. Tables overflowed with potluck dishes representing the diverse cultures of our residents. Children chased each other across the grass. Conversation and laughter filled the air. Alina found me by the dessert table, her eyes bright with happiness. "I planted tomatoes again this year," she told me proudly, "and peppers and cucumbers too." "No violations?" I asked with a smile. "Not one," she replied, though Maria did ask for some cucumber plants for her own garden. As the sun began to set, I walked home along streets that felt genuinely like a community for the first time since I had moved there. Neighbors waved from porches. Several stopped to chat. There was an ease, a comfort that had been missing under Richard's regime of fear and intimidation. I reached my front door, the same door that had once been locked against me. I inserted my key and turned it smoothly, the door opening without resistance. Inside, my home welcomed me with familiar comfort. On my entry table sat a framed news clipping, the headline announcing Richard's conviction and 5-year prison sentence for embezzlement and fraud. Next to it stood a small terracotta pot filled with bright red geraniums, technically still against the old HOA guidelines. But those guidelines had been rewritten, not to allow anything and everything, but to create reasonable standards that preserved both property values and human dignity. I placed my keys on the table and smiled at the flowers. They represented more than decoration now. They symbolized a community that had found its voice, homeowners who had reclaimed their power, and the unexpected journey that began when I could not open my own front door. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected beginnings. Sometimes it starts with a locked door that becomes the key to setting everything right.